Okay, whereas the last lecture focused on material objects and the meanings that we place on them, this lecture will focus more on cultural processes, both material and ideological, through which we invest meaning in our material cultures. The three key processes we'll be focusing on are cultural gatekeeping, memory and memory work, and the production of space. So, on this first point of cultural gatekeeping, we'll focus on Arlene Davila's chapter on East Harlem and Cisha Boya's article on the artwork of Ruben Ortiz Torres. So when we think about gatekeeping, it's important to remember that we're both talking about institutions and the way that we've internalized those institutions through the sort of value judgments that we make. We can think about gatekeeping in terms of previous readings that we've done. So for example, Chon Noriega's discussion of beautiful identities as this contradiction of, on the one hand, inclusion, but on the other hand, how that inclusion is constantly regulated to the point of basically being excluded. We can also think about gatekeeping in terms of what Professor Ontiveros calls the news net, what we've come to internalize as what we expect to be entering this category of the news. So when we think about cultural gatekeeping, we're talking about our relationship to official forms of culture. The gatekeeping refers to the process of letting some things in and keeping most things out, right? A filtration system where we don't really question the process taking place, but we accept it as something to be true. When we talk about some things being more important than others, that's reflecting our internalization of this gatekeeping process. So, looking at Arlene Davila's chapter, she talks about the planning process of community redevelopment and how the actual community of Puerto Ricans and Latinos were invited to be involved. She talks about this community involvement in the process as a type of spin. It was less about honestly listening to the community and more about having that performance of listening, right? We told the community to be a part of it, but they chose not to, that sort of spin. So as we think about this as a gatekeeping process, right, the bureaucratic process as a way of filtering out who actually gets heard, we have to ask ourselves, who are the specific judges in this process, right? Who are the arbiters? Who are the people with the invested authority to make these types of decisions of what gets recognized and what doesn't, and who gets recognized and who doesn't? We can see this is coloring the background of Cisha Boya's article on the artwork, because in talking about lowriders and leaf blowers, he's talking about how Torres uses these objects that we don't associate with high culture, but makes them art. And by them becoming art, they enter the official space of the museum and receive a different type of recognition that they normally do. On the one hand, the lowrider as this devalued, denigrated object becomes part of what we officially recognize as being high artwork. And the leaf blower, this tool that we forget the cultural debates that are taken around it, finally becomes recognized as the complicated material culture that it is. So, in this way we can think about culture and the way that we use culture in order to remember, not just on an individual level, but at a larger cultural level. So here we'll be focusing on Davila's chapter again and putting it in conversation with Sunaina Myra's chapter on Indo-Chic. A big question to ask is, how do we remember? And how do we involve objects and practices as part of the process? This goes back to the article by Jairo Perez in week 3, where he uses the term organized forgetting. We have to ask ourselves, what do we remember? But in the process, what do we forget? And so asking these questions about collective memory, of course, draws us back to thinking about cultural gatekeeping and how there are these coerced and legitimized forms of remembering to go along these coerced and legitimized forms of forgetting. So we're going to focus on one process of memory. We're going to focus on those hegemonic forms of remembering and the way that Asian Americans and Latinas and Latinos respond to that. So you remember this diagram, the vertical hierarchy of culture that talks about high aesthetic culture, which is guarded by cultural gatekeepers and institutions, manufactured by cultural elites and seen as having a particular amount of cultural value. as distinguished from low popular culture, which is seen as particularly mundane, lacking a certain type of value, lacking a certain type of difficulty, but also being characterized by its accessibility, whether through grassroots cultural production, being of the people by the people, or being mass culture, being manufactured in mass. And you recall the way that we summarized it in terms of as legitimacy goes up, its accessibility and access goes down. We can talk about hegemonic memory in relation to this vertical hierarchy of culture. When we think about what forms of memory and what actual memories are encouraged by these official forms of culture. With the Arlene Davila chapter, she talks about the creation, the planned creation of an arts and entertainment district in East Harlem. And how this arts and entertainment district also invited in Latina and Latino celebrities and figures that, under the guise of representing the community. But the actual people who lived there were not being represented in the process. So as we think about cultural memory, we have to ask ourselves what gets remembered and what and who get forgotten. So we have to really challenge the way that categories such as Asian American and Latina and Latino can actually be co-opted and reappropriated, right? Whereas these are categories that came out of civil rights struggles, we have to be mindful of the way that hegemonic power can reappropriate them from out of our hands. And this is distinctly what we see in Sunaina Myra's chapter on New Age Indo-Chic. Because as you see in the passage where people talk about, on the one hand, South Asian Americans celebrating their culture, but then also Americans saying that this is a custom that's being lost and forgotten in India itself. We have to ask the question of who has the authority to remember and whose memory is taken more seriously. Because when it's, for example, South Asian Americans celebrating South Asian things, it's seen as being like an ethnic heritage thing. But once, for example, non-South Asian producers are doing it, it becomes hip and trendy and multicultural. Think about the mainstreaming of yoga in the US. So that we have to ask the question of for what purpose are we remembering? Not just who profits from this remembering, but who benefits from this remembering. In the case of the mainstreaming of yoga as an example, as we think about who benefits, on the one hand it started as a religious practice and now has become so mainstream that we think of it as being this Orientalist project, right? We think of it through an Orientalist lens of it being this sort of spiritual reconnection that we don't understand but we believe because it comes from India. So, related to this question of memory and the way that we place it on physical objects and physical places is what we can understand as the control of place and the production of space. One last time we'll be talking about Arlene Davila's book chapter, but also we'll be revisiting Jenny Moles' piece on Thai restaurants. So as we think about space, we need to make an analytical distinction. On the one hand, there's place, which is the physical location and its material features. And from that place is derived space, the cultural and social meanings that humans put on place. So for example, think for a second about where you are in terms of place. You'll notice it becomes difficult because we're so used to thinking about spaces, right? Where you are is not necessarily your bedroom when we talk about it in terms of place. In terms of place, it's part of a particular building. A certain number of square footage by a certain number of square footage. But, so, if we think about place and space, we're then thinking about the way that we fill places with cultural significance. So for example, in Jenny Moles' article on Thai restaurants, she makes a distinction between the front and the back of the restaurant. The front and the back doesn't necessarily refer to place as much as it refers to space, right? Because we're talking about how we as people inhabit that space and the sort of meanings that we place on it, whether they're spoken or not. So we ask ourselves what exists where in place, but also what is the logic of the space? For example, what actually separates you from where you're supposed to be from where you're not supposed to be? On the one hand, there may be actual physical barriers, like a countertop or a door, but oftentimes it takes place through spatial arrangements, right? Through norms and customs that we internalize. We oftentimes feel that in a restaurant, the only place that we can be is the small table quarantined off for us. So as we think about what Moles has to say about the front and the back of the restaurant as being related to place and space, we can then think about a really large scale like that addressed by Arlene Davila in talking about East Harlem. So in terms of place and space, for place, she's talking about the built environment, right? The environment that humans have built and inhabited, not just physically, but also culturally. In terms of space, she's talking about the construction of Latinidad, right? The idea of Latinas and Latinos and culture. She asks, in what ways is Latinidad being packaged and kind of attached to this redevelopment project, even though the actual people and the actual built environment associated with them will be completely demolished and rebuilt with these corporate interests behind it. So, as you can tell from this discussion, Moles and Davila very much focus on these sort of hegemonic projects of controlling place and constructing space. We can also think about those counter-hegemonic uses of place and space and how those counter-hegemonic uses can also relate to memory work, right? The active role of building forms of culture that will help communities remember those histories that would otherwise be forgotten. So the real task of the primary text for this week is thinking about not just how we get caught up in hegemony through material culture, but also how we can use it to try and found other forms of resistance that may not be as large as a social movement, but distinctly relate to remembering against the grain. Okay? So I really look forward to your analyses. We are approaching the end of the course, so ask me any questions if you have them. If not, have a great week.